The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from Alara's bones, the moisture from the cracked soil, and the sound from the world, leaving only its own mournful howl. It scoured the plains of western Nebraska, a relentless sculptor of dust and despair. Her small homestead, a sod-roofed cabin and a listing barn, was an island in an ocean of brown grass that bent and swayed in a constant, weary surrender. It had been 14 months since the wind had carried away the last of Thomas's scent from his worn flannel shirt, and now it seemed intent on carrying her away, piece by weary piece. Each morning, she would stand on her porch, a hand shielding her eyes against the glare of a vast, indifferent sky, and feel herself shrinking. The world was too large, and she had become too small to fill even this meager patch of it. Her hands, once soft and capable at the quilting frame, were now gnarled and raw from mending fences with wire that bit into her flesh and hauling water from a well that seemed to grow deeper with every passing day. Grief was a physical thing, a weight that settled in her chest and made every breath an effort. It was a cold companion in her narrow bed and a silent guest at her solitary table. She was a widow. The word itself was brittle like a dead leaf. It was a closing, a finality, a door shut and bolted against the future. She felt broken, not in a way that could be mended like a fractured bone, but shattered, like a pane of glass dropped on a stone floor, the pieces too numerous and too small to ever be reassembled. The woman she had been, the wife who laughed at Thomas's quiet jokes, the partner who shared his dreams of a life wrested from this stubborn land, was gone. In her place was this hollowed-out creature, a ghost haunting the shell of a life. Today the wind carried a new threat. A rider approached, not a neighbor, for she had none close enough to call, but a man from the town of Redemption, a place that had offered her none. Jedediah Thorne dismounted, his movements stiff and proprietary, as if he already owned the ground beneath his polished boots. He was a man whose softness was a lie. His fleshy hands and smooth words concealed a core of unyielding greed. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt like a mockery. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice a buttery balm that failed to soothe the sharp edges of her apprehension. "A hard wind today. This land asks much of a person." Alara simply nodded, her arms crossed over her chest, a frail barricade against his intrusion. She did not invite him in. The inside of her home was the only sanctuary she had left, and his presence would profane it. "I won't mince words," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the weathered barn, the struggling garden, the general air of decay that clung to the place like dust. "It's too much for a woman alone. I've come to repeat my offer. A fair price for the deed. Enough to see you settled comfortably back east, with your people." His fair price was an insult, a fraction of what the land, with its deep well and proximity to the coming railroad, was worth. Thomas had told her that, in whispers during his last days. "Don't let Thorne have it for nothing, Alara. This is your future, but what future? A lonely room in a sister's house, a burden and a relic. The price is not fair, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice thin but steady. "And this is my home." Thorne's smile tightened. It was a predator's grimace. "Home? It's a grave, madam. You're burying yourself out here with his memory. A woman needs a man's hand to guide and protect her. This land will break you, if it hasn't already." His words struck a raw nerve, echoing the whispers of her own heart in the deepest hours of the night. "I am already broken." The thought was a cold certainty. She could feel the fissures, the cracks running through her soul. She was holding herself together with sheer, stubborn will, and she knew, with a terrifying clarity, that it would not be enough. "I am not selling," she repeated, the words tasting of ash. He replaced his hat, his eyes cold and dismissive. "You are a foolish woman. You will change your mind, or the land will change it for you." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more menacing than before. She watched until he was a speck on the horizon, feeling the truth of his threat settle over her like a shroud. She was alone, and the wolves were circling. It was then, as she turned to retreat into the fragile safety of her cabin, that she saw him. High on the ridge that bordered the western edge of her property, a figure stood silhouetted against the unforgiving sky. He was immense, a giant of a man, so large he seemed less a person and more a feature of the landscape, like a great, weathered stone. She had heard the stories in town, the fearful, mocking whispers about the recluse of the high hills. They called him Silas, a half-wild hermit, some said. A simpleton with the strength of an ox, said others. Dangerous, unpredictable. He never came to town, never spoke to anyone. He just existed, a boogeyman to frighten children and a cautionary tale for adults. He was simply standing there, motionless, watching her. He held no rifle, made no threatening gesture, yet his presence was a violation. It was another pair of eyes on her vulnerability, another witness to her slow erosion. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face, stinging her eyes. Was he with Thorn? Had the man sent this giant to intimidate her further? Fear, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. She stumbled back, fumbling with the latch on her door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slammed it shut, slid the heavy wooden bolt into place, and leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The howl of the wind outside seemed to mock her, a chorus for the twin threats of Thorn's greed and the silent, watchful giant on the hill. The world had shrunk to the four walls of her cabin, and still it felt as though she was being crushed. For 3 days the giant was a fixture on the ridge. He appeared with the dawn and vanished with the dusk, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Alara's fear curdled into a kind of simmering dread. She did her chores with a rifle propped against the fence, her senses stretched taut, every rustle of the grass, every cry of a hawk, a potential prelude to attack. She felt hunted, her small patch of the world transformed into an arena, and she the sole, cornered prey. He did nothing. He just watched. The inaction was its own form of torture, a slow tightening of a knot in her stomach. What did he want? Was he waiting for her to collapse, to simply give up and perish so he could scavenge what was left? The townsfolk's whispers echoed in her mind. Half-wild, dangerous. On the 4th night, the sky broke open. A storm, born of the vast, empty plains, descended upon her homestead with a biblical fury. Rain came not in drops but in solid sheets, driven horizontally by a wind that screamed like a banshee. The cabin groaned under the assault. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very foundations, and lightning bleached the world white in stark, terrifying flashes. Alara sat huddled by her cold hearth, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the world being torn apart. Sometime after midnight, she heard it. A sound worse than the thunder, a violent, splintering crack followed by a deafening roar as a section of the sod roof over the storeroom gave way. Water poured in, a cascade of mud and debris. She scrambled with a bucket, her hands shaking, but it was a futile gesture, like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. The water was ruining her winter stores, the sacks of flour, the dried beans, the precious seed grain for the spring planting. Everything. Thomas had built that roof. His hands had cut and laid the sod, and now it too was gone. A sob, raw and ragged, tore from her throat. She sank to her knees in the spreading pool of muddy water, the fight finally draining out of her. The storm, the land, Thorn, the giant on the hill, it was all one malevolent entity, and it had won. She was broken. Thorn was right. She was a foolish woman, and this was her grave. She must have slept, slumped against the wall in exhaustion, for she awoke to a strange, rhythmic sound. Thump, scrape, thump. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent, save for that sound. It was coming from above. Cautiously, heart pounding a nervous rhythm, she unbolted the door and stepped outside. The early morning light was pale and thin, and there on her roof was the giant. Silas was working with a focused, methodical calm. He had somehow dragged a massive fallen cottonwood from the creek bed and, with a broadaxe that looked like a toy in his massive hands, had hewn it into rough planks. Now, he was fitting them into place, his movements economical and precise. He had already cleared the debris, and was constructing a sturdy, wooden patch over the gaping hole. He moved with an incongruous grace, his immense weight distributed with a care that belied his size. He was not a creature of brute force, but of deliberate practiced strength. Alara stood frozen, clutching the doorframe, a maelstrom of confusion and fear warring within her. He had not come to harm her. He had come to help. He must have seen the roof go in the night, must have come down from his ridge in the heart of the storm. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. He simply worked. The rhythmic sound of his labor was the only sound in the quiet morning. It was the sound of repair, the sound of something broken being made whole again. When he was finished, the patch was seamless, stronger than the original roof had ever been. He climbed down the side of the cabin as easily as another man might use a ladder. He still did not look at her. He walked to the woodpile, which was a chaotic mess of splintered logs from her own clumsy attempts at chopping. He picked up her small, inadequate axe, looked at it for a moment, then set it down gently. He then retrieved his own massive axe and, in a flurry of powerful, efficient swings, reduced a pile of logs to a neat stack of perfectly split firewood in a matter of minutes. He stacked it neatly by her door, the pile taller than she was. And then, without a word, without a backward glance, he turned and walked back toward the western ridge, his broad back receding until he was once more a silhouette against the horizon. Alara stood amidst the quiet evidence of his labor, the secure roof, the mountain of firewood, and felt a single hot tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or of fear, but of something else entirely, something she hadn't felt in so long she could no longer give it a name. She was still alone, but for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel entirely abandoned. The silent pact began. It was a language without words, a relationship built of gesture and necessity across the empty space that separated her cabin from his ridge. The giant, Silas, was no longer a figure of menace, but a quiet, watchful presence. He remained distant, a part of the landscape, but his influence was felt in the small, profound ways her life began to mend itself. One morning, she went to the well to find the old rope, frayed and perilous, had been replaced with a new one, thick and strong, the pulley mechanism cleaned and oiled so that the bucket rose with an impossible smoothness. She hadn't even realized how much effort the simple act of drawing water had become until it was suddenly gone. Another day, a late frost threatened her small vegetable patch, the tender green shoots that represented her hope for sustenance. She went to bed with a heavy heart, expecting to wake to a field of black, withered leaves. Instead, she awoke to see that a crude but effective windbreak of woven branches and canvas had been erected along the north side of the garden. The delicate plants were untouched, sheltered from the killing cold. He must have worked through the night, a silent guardian moving in the darkness while she slept. Alara's fear gave way to a deep, humbling gratitude. How could she repay him? He asked for nothing, expected nothing. He seemed to exist on air and solitude. She began her own silent conversation. She baked an extra loaf of bread, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and left it on the flat top of a fence post at the edge of her property. The next morning it was gone. She filled a large jar with cool water from her newly repaired well and left it in the same spot. Two disappeared. Once, after a particularly grueling day of weeding, she found a small, perfectly carved wooden bird sitting on her porch rail. Its lines were simple but elegant, the grain of the wood coaxed into the shape of a meadowlark in midsong. It was a gift of impossible tenderness from a man the world had dismissed as a brute. She took it inside, her fingers tracing its smooth surface, and placed it on the mantelpiece next to the faded photograph of Thomas. The two objects, one a memory of a love that was, the other a symbol of a connection she could not comprehend, seemed to hold a quiet conversation of their own. She began to watch him as he had watched her. She saw him not as a giant, but as a man. She saw the patience with which he moved, the way he would stand for hours, simply observing the flight of an eagle or the slow passage of clouds. He was a part of this land, not a conqueror of it. He understood its rhythms, its cruelties, and its spare beauties. He was as weathered and as resilient as the ancient, wind-scoured rocks on his ridge. The townsfolk saw a monster because it was easier than seeing a man who lived by a different code, a man who had rejected their small, judgmental world for something vaster and more honest. Her internal landscape began to shift. The sharp edges of her grief started to soften, worn smooth by this new, quiet rhythm of shared existence. The silence in her cabin felt less like emptiness and more like peace. She still missed Thomas with an ache that was a permanent part of her, but the feeling of being utterly, hopelessly adrift was receding. She was anchored by the presence of the man on the hill. She did not know his story, his sorrows, his reasons. She knew only his actions, and his actions spoke of a profound and steady kindness, a protective instinct that asked for nothing in return. She was still broken, she knew, but she had begun to feel as if someone was carefully, patiently, gathering the scattered pieces. One afternoon, as she worked in her garden, she looked up toward the ridge and saw him standing there. This time, she did not flinch or reach for her rifle. She simply raised a hand, a small, hesitant wave. For a long moment, he remained motionless. Then, slowly, he raised one of his own massive hands in return. The gesture, stark and simple against the vast sky, was as momentous as 1,000 words. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a bridge built across the wild, empty space. The fragile peace was shattered by the return of Jedediah Thorne. He did not come alone this time. 2 men flanked him, their faces hard and impassive, their hands resting on the pistols holstered at their hips. They were not farmers or townsfolk. They were hired muscle, men who made their living through intimidation and violence. The pretense of civility was gone. Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury as he dismounted, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. "I've wasted enough time with you, old woman," he spat, forgoing any greeting. He held out a piece of paper, the deed, and a pen. "You will sign this. Now." Alara stood her ground on the porch, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had known this was coming. In her brief respite, she had forgotten the nature of wolves. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "This land is not for sale." Thorne laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Everything is for sale. You're just too stubborn to see it. This land is wasted on you. It needs a man to make it profitable. I am that man." He took a step toward her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Now, are you going to sign? Or do my associates need to convince you?" The 2 men dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate, their intent unmistakable. They began to spread out, flanking her, cutting off any chance of escape. Alara's gaze darted from one to the other, her mind racing. The cabin door was behind her, but she would never make it. She scanned the ridge line, a desperate, instinctual prayer forming in her mind. But it was empty. Silas was not there. A wave of desolation washed over her. Of course, he wasn't. He was a recluse, not her keeper. Their silent understanding was a fantasy she had constructed to keep the terror at bay. The reality was this: 3 men, a desolate prairie, and no one to hear her scream. She backed away until her shoulders hit the rough wood of the cabin wall. Her hand fumbled behind her, finding the handle of the heavy iron poker she'd left by the door. She pulled it free, its weight a pathetic comfort. "Get off my property," she ordered, brandishing it before her. Thorne only sneered. "Put that down before you hurt yourself." He nodded to one of his men. "Get the pen in her hand." The man started forward, a cruel smile on his lips. He reached for her, and Alara swung the poker in a wide, clumsy arc. He dodged it easily, grabbing her wrist in a grip of iron. The poker clattered to the wooden porch. He twisted her arm behind her back, the pain sharp and immediate. Thorne advanced, holding the deed out like a death warrant. "Last chance, Mrs. Vance." It was in that moment of absolute despair, as Thorne's shadow fell over her, that a new shadow joined it, vast and eclipsing. A voice, low and resonant as the shifting of deep earth, broke the tense silence. "Let her go." They all froze, Standing at the edge of the yard, having emerged from the cottonwoods by the creek as silently as a ghost, was Silas. He was not a silhouette on a distant ridge now. He was a towering reality of muscle and bone. In one hand, he held his wood-splitting axe, its head gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. He wasn't holding it as a weapon, but simply held it, an extension of his arm as a farmer might hold a scythe. His face was calm, his eyes fixed on the man holding Alara. He radiated an aura of immense, contained power, more intimidating than any overt threat. Thorn recovered first, his face flushing with anger and a flicker of fear. "What is this? Get out of here, you lumbering half-wit. This is private business." Silas ignored him. His gaze moved to Alara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Is this man troubling you, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice a quiet rumble that nonetheless carried across the yard with absolute authority. The formal address, the simple, respectful question, was a shield. The man holding her arm hesitated, his grip slackening slightly. He looked from Silas to Thorn, uncertainty clouding his features. Thorn, enraged by the challenge to his dominance, made a fatal miscalculation. He shoved Alara forward, trying to use her as a distraction. "Deal with him," he snarled at his other man. Silas moved. It was not a rush, but a flow, a movement of terrifying speed and efficiency. He took 2 great strides that covered the distance of the yard. The second hired man, drawing his pistol, found his wrist suddenly encased in a hand the size of a dinner plate. Silas didn't strike him or shout. He simply squeezed. The man cried out, his fingers going numb, and the pistol dropped into the dust. With his other hand, Silas took hold of the man pinning Alara, lifting him off his feet as if he were a child and setting him down hard several feet away. The man stumbled and fell, his bravado utterly broken. Now only Thorn was left. He stood, pale and shaking, between the giant and the woman he had terrorized. Silas took another step forward, the shadow he cast completely engulfing the smaller man. He did not raise the axe. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked down at him. "You will leave this place," Silas said, each word deliberate and final. "You will not trouble Mrs. Vance again. You will not return. Do you understand?" The question was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Thorn, utterly cowed, could only nod, his jaw working silently. "Go," Silas commanded. Thorn scrambled for his horse, hauling himself into the saddle with clumsy, panicked movements. His 2 men, one nursing a crushed hand, the other his pride, followed suit. They fled without a backward glance, their retreat a cloud of ignominious dust on the horizon. The sudden silence was deafening. The wind whispered through the grass, the only sound in the world. Alara stood on the porch, her arm throbbing, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. She looked at Silas, this man who had been a specter of her fear and had become her salvation. He stood in her yard, solid and real, the dust settling around his worn boots, the protector she never knew she had, the strength she thought had vanished from the world forever. The poker lay at her feet, a useless stick of iron. He was the only weapon she had needed. Her breath hitched, and a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her. She leaned against the post, the last of her strength failing her, and finally found her voice. It was a whisper, carried on the wind. "Thank you." The silence that followed the men's departure was profound, stretching between Alara and Silas, filled with the weight of all that had just happened. He stood in the yard, his massive frame seeming to anchor the very earth beneath him. The axe was still in his hand, but he lowered it now, resting its head in the dust. He looked less like a warrior and more like a weary laborer whose work was done. Alara's trembling subsided, replaced by a deep, resonant calm that seemed to emanate from him. "You should come inside," she said, her voice stronger now. Let me make you some tea." It was a wholly inadequate offering for the rescue he had performed, but it was all she had. It was an invitation across the final threshold, from her yard into her home, from a silent understanding into something more. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze falling to his own dusty boots, as if he felt unworthy of crossing her doorstep. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He leaned the axe against the outside wall of the cabin and approached the porch. He had to duck his head significantly to pass through the doorway Thomas had built for a man of average height. Inside the small, tidy space, his size was even more pronounced. He seemed to fill the entire room, yet he moved with a surprising, gentle care, his large hands held at his sides, careful not to brush against the dried herbs hanging from the rafters or the delicate wooden bird on the mantel. Elara busied herself with the kettle and the stove, the familiar domestic actions a balm to her frayed nerves. Silas stood awkwardly in the center of the room before she gestured to one of the two sturdy chairs at her small table. He sat, the chair groaning in protest but holding his weight. They sat in silence as the water heated, a silence that was no longer empty or tense, but companionable, resting between them like a soft blanket. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire she'd just stoked and the whistle of the rising kettle. She poured the tea into two chipped ceramic mugs, placing one before him. His large, calloused fingers wrapped around it, dwarfing the cup. He did not drink, but seemed to draw warmth from it, his eyes fixed on the rising steam. Elara, needing to fill the space with more than just gratitude, found herself speaking, the words spilling out of a place she had kept locked away for over a year. "I thought I was finished," she began, her voice low and thick with unshed tears. "After Thomas passed, this place, it felt like a tomb. The wind, the work, it all just wore me down. I told myself I was strong, but I wasn't. I'm too broken for anything but just getting through the day." She looked down at her own hands, twisted and worn. Thorn was right about that. This land breaks you. Love breaks you. I'm too old to mend. It was a confession of her deepest fear. The truth of her lonely existence laid bare on the table between them. Silas listened, his gaze unwavering. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes. He simply received her words, his quiet presence an act of profound respect. When she fell silent, the confession hanging in the air, he finally looked away from his mug, down at his own immense hands resting on the table. He studied them for a long moment, as if they were foreign objects. Then he spoke, and his voice, though still a low rumble, was laced with an emotion that seemed to crack its stony surface. "Mrs. Vance." Elara, the use of her given name was startlingly intimate, yet utterly natural. "Broken things, they can be the strongest. A bone that mends is stronger at the break." He looked up, his eyes, which she now saw were a deep, gentle brown, meeting hers. "The world tried to break me from the day I was born. People see my size and they see a monster. Or a fool. An animal to be feared or mocked." He took a slow breath, the words coming from a place of deep and ancient hurt. "They don't see a man who learned to read from his mother's Bible before she passed. They don't see a man who watches the seasons change and thanks God for the hawk's flight, for the purple flowers that grow between the rocks where nothing else can survive." His gaze drifted toward the window, toward the harsh landscape that was their shared home. "I saw you from my hill," he continued softly. "I saw you the day after your husband was buried. I saw you stand on that porch and face the wind when it tried to tear you down. I saw you fight this land, fight the sorrow. I saw you stand when anyone else would have fallen, when anyone else would have run. You are like those flowers, Elara, growing where no one else can." He turned his gaze back to her, and the intensity in his eyes held her captive. "I haven't just been watching you. I've been praying." He paused, the word hanging in the warm air of the cabin with sacred weight. "My whole life, I've prayed for a soul as strong as yours. I just never knew it would be you." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the image she held of herself. He didn't see a broken old widow. He didn't see a foolish woman clinging to a grave. He saw strength. He saw resilience. He saw a survivor. It was not a declaration of romantic passion, but something far deeper, far more profound. It was a declaration of recognition soul to soul. He, the outcast giant, had seen in her, the grieving widow, a spirit that mirrored his own. A single tear, the one she had held back, finally fell, splashing onto the worn wood of the table. But it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of a dam breaking, letting in a light she thought had been extinguished forever. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time, past the sighs and the silence, and saw the gentle, lonely man within. She reached across the table and laid her small, weathered hand on his. His hand was warm and solid, a bedrock of strength and kindness. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and gently enclosed hers. Outside, the perpetual wind still blew across the plains, but for the first time, it didn't sound like a lament. Sounded like a song. The land was still harsh, the future still uncertain, but she was no longer adrift. She was anchored. A small, genuine smile touched Alara's lips. Hope, quiet and stubborn and beautiful, had taken root in the most unforgiving of soils, nurtured by the silent prayers of a giant. In the warm glow of the firelight, two solitary souls, weathered and broken by the world, had finally, blessedly, found sanctuary.